Welcome back, Afro-Latinxers, to another video. In this video, we will be talking about or deconstructing the myths that Latinos have about African history. This will be an interview, so stay tuned. Before we, started asking you any questions, I want you to tell my viewers a little bit about yourself, like where you were raised, like how do you identify, and what do you do now, and where you live, and stuff like that.
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Adnan Shafi, and I am from Kenya, although I'll just call it like a melting pot of different tribal identities. So I am part, obviously, ethnically Somali from my mother's side, specifically my grandfather, but I also have roots that go towards the Kikuyu tribe, the Maasai tribe, and also some of my grandparents may have been indentured servants that were taken by the British to build the railway in Kenya. So that's basically my ethnic background. But in terms of my upbringing, I was born and raised in Kenya. And for my last 2 years of high school, I studied in South Africa, specifically Johannesburg. And I'm kind of now just here in the UK studying law and politics. But in politics, I'm having a focus this year on global political economy and development, and as well as colonialism as well. And next year, I might focus on anti-colonial thought and African thought in response to the post-colonial movements. So that's a bit about me. And I took a bit of an interest in African history around a year ago. I just started researching on my own and started reading journals, and I started reading a bit more and decided to share all of that knowledge with my platform. And I specifically took knowledge from channels like Home Team History, From Nothing, all these big channels. And they've really inspired me to kind of start my own show as well. And, just speak about important issues on the African continent and in the diaspora as well.
That's awesome. Like, how was your education in Kenya and South Africa when it like relates to African history and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I was one student who actually went to a British system school. So back home, we obviously have a Kenyan system, which is called 844. And then we also have British system schools, but there's also schools that follow the American system. So I went to a school that follows the British system. And I was kind of brought up in that sort of part of the system towards my later years of education. So I'd say towards early primary school, that's when I was in the 844 system, but I never really got to read much about the history. I've talked to people and they said that they have learned about Kenyan history specifically, but they still haven't gone in depth into like African history as a whole. And when I moved to South Africa, I actually moved to the African Leadership Academy. And that's a school that really focuses and hones in on this topic of, Africa as a whole. What does it mean to be African? So I got to learn from a really interesting perspective, and I learned a bit more about post-colonial African history. But I also started to get a glimpse into figures such as Mansa Musa, the Mali Empire, all these different things. And that was kind of where I'd say all this started in terms of researching. And that kind of inspired me to look deeper and dig further into what it truly means to have an African identity and read into African history.
So part of it is because of the education you got in South Africa, and then a lot of it is just your own work that you're doing yourself.
Yeah, most definitely.
So the reason why I wanted to have you on my page is because most of my viewers are of Latin descent.
Sure.
And I identify as an Afro-Latina because I believe that my history, yes, it's a history of colonization and the enslavement of West African people. But oftentimes in the Latino community, a lot of our African history is not really like spoken about. And we kind of get erased, like Afro-Latinos get erased. I don't know how much you know about Afro-Latinos, but we kind of get erased, and we get erased a lot through our history, education, and through media. And just like you, like I was born and raised in America, but my ethnicity is Dominican. So my parents were born and raised in the Dominican Republic, but I was raised here in America. And I had to, like you, I had to learn about not only my Dominican history, but also African history on my own, because in America, they don't teach that. Like African
Yeah.
history starts at slavery. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
That's
this
it.
was really
And
important.
um, so yeah, I have to do my own research. And I thought that it would be a great idea to have you on because on your TikTok page, you seem to know a lot about African history, a lot more than me. And I think that it's important that the Latino community learn more about African history before colonization, because there is a lot of like myths that go around in the Latino community about Africa. Okay. So I think that you would be the great person, the best person to do this. So again, I'm so happy that you're here to help me answer some of these questions for my viewers. So I want to start. I want you to talk about. So just talk about first off. Start off by talking about the dynamics of of slavery in Africa. So
Mm.
like, because oftentimes Latinos will say, and they used the oh well Africans enslaved their own people as
Mm.
an argument to justify what the Europeans did to the West African um, people that they enslaved. So they always use that as a comparison. So they're like, well, Africans did it to their own people, so why is it so bad that the Europeans did it to Africans? So can you explain slavery in Africa and how is it similar or different to um, the slave trade, the
Mm.
transatlantic slave trade?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to note a couple of differences. And also, when you're discussing history, I think a lot of people come to the table with this idea of presentism, just like, they think that the people that were living hundreds of years ago automatically have the values that we do. And obviously, this is something that it's a fallacy, right? So before we speak about the, slavery, I don't want people to think that I'm over here, justifying, slavery and be like, oh, slavery is a great thing. No, obviously there's different asymmetrical relationships that have existed throughout all societies, and slavery was that thing that just sort of existed everywhere, right? But in Africa, obviously, it was something different. And as you can see, I'm not going to speak as though I know every single system, but I can definitely tell you of a few that existed during the pre-colonial period. And you have different relationships. For example, obviously you have uh, prisoners of war. That was one way in which you could become a slave in different parts of Africa. So obviously, when there was different tribal tensions and that would result in war, you'd end up being taken in as a captive, and then you'd have to serve for a certain amount of time. But one key feature that we note is that even within these societies, a lot of the slavery was not hereditary. That's the key thing. It was not hereditary, and in addition to that, you also should note that it was not necessarily that you just become a field worker or something like that. And even still, there were certain rights that were afforded to people. Of course, there were certain cultures which there were certain, I'd say disturbing things. For example, you could have, um, certain people being put as a sacrifice, or like they would face capital punishment instead of their owner, right? And that could be something that we can say roughly parallels that element of slavery, but that was in some communities and wasn't necessarily like the norm. And if we look closer towards certain other forms of slavery, you can see that the main thing was to separate people from their kinship, right? So it wasn't necessarily that you wanted to just use people for their own economic benefit, but it was more or less like you wanted people who would be loyal to the state. And what's very interesting is that some slaves would actually be a check and balance for the government, right? So you'd have different slaves who would be, for example, in charge of the military. And of course, if you give someone who's in charge of the military, they're going to be a check and balance on the king or queen, right? And what you can actually see is in different societies, specifically, I'm going to mention the Malian Empire. That was one where obviously there was a slave empire, right? But obviously, if you look at the Koroko and Foga, which is the constitution of the Malian Empire, I believe in Article 20, it says, you are the master of this, the slave, not the bag that he carries. And it talks about, and the commentary on that specific article also mentions that, you know, you have to work for a reasonable amount of time during the day, and it has to be for 5 days a week. And also, you know, the Malian Empire did convert to Islam towards the later periods. And obviously Islam has certain provisions for prisoners of war. And obviously there's certain rulings, you can't even like, you know, hit a slave, etc. Or like this prisoner of war in quotes, right? So there's different aspects to it from the Malian Empire, although I can't even say that they practice Islam properly as well. So it's very possible that they did also abuse those rights in terms of like, you know, that they had over prisoners of war. And that's something that happens everywhere. But as for people who actually sort of shifted that power balance, I'll give you a few examples. Like Mansa Sakura. Mansa Sakura was someone who had rose up within the royal courts of Mali, and he was a slave, right? And he was one of those people where it was the king that actually set him free. And when someone tried to usurp the throne, he actually started a counter-revolution and brought back the throne. So, and essentially that. So that's the main thing in terms of slavery on the African continent. It's not really comparable because when you look at chattel slavery in the US, it was hereditary. It was far more brutal. I can say that for a fact. When you compare it to most areas in terms of Africa in general, and the fact that it was something that was race-based. That's also another thing that was very novel, and it's something that Europeans invented. We've never seen anything like that before, right? Except for maybe the pre-Islamic Arab slavery. That was something that was quite common. So yeah.
So in Latin America, I mean, Latin America is huge, and each Latin American country got rid of slavery at different times. And even, I mean, I feel like even Latin American slavery was a bit different from US slavery. However, I always see it that like the Spanish came over and they started, the Spanish and the Portuguese came over and they started chattel slavery. So I think there's a big like Latin Americans have this belief that because slavery ended a bit, like maybe depending on where you lived, right? In the Dominican Republic, it ended around the 1820s, right? So that's like what, 50, 60 years before America. And most people who were slaves in the Dominican Republic were normally of fully African descent. So most times if you were of mixed race, so mixed European and Black, you were able to not be a slave. And I'm not saying all, we would call them mulattoes, were not slaves, but for the most part, we had a mulatto population that was free of slavery. However, fully African descent people were still slaves. And in the Dominican Republic, it was compared to Haiti. I don't know if you know their history too much, but in the Dominican Republic, compared to Haiti, it was cattle ranching slavery after the first 100 years, because the first 100 years was plantation based, and then they moved towards cattle ranching. So it changed a little bit, where the relationship between master and slave was more seen as like a more equal based. However, for me, slavery is slavery. And there was a time in history where people in the Dominican Republic didn't want to be slaves. So they united with Haiti in order to end slavery in the Dominican Republic and across Latin America. So Haiti was one of the leaders in ending slavery in Latin America. But I don't know, I think it's very detrimental when they try to compare the African slavery to slavery in the Americas, because it's kind of like they like to justify slavery. And again, it's not that slavery is not good, point blank, period, right? Any kind of slavery, I think, is bad. But type of slavery that existed here over in the Americas, I always find that it's very different. And I guess I wanted you to talk about like, I guess like the notion that people sold, the African people sold their own people into slavery. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Also, first, even just before I get into that, I think when people try to compare systems of slavery, you need to really understand what you're getting into, because even the scholarship has really struggled in terms of defining what slavery actually is. And this is something that people don't really know. It's because, like, what defines an asymmetrical relationship and like makes it slavery, right? Because there's the notion of, do we count positive freedom as, I mean, you depriving someone of positive freedom, like, you can't do this, you can't do that. Or like, is it something about negative freedom where it's like, you can do all this except for that, right? You have to look at it from different perspectives. So when people talk about, oh, slavery happened in Africa, it's like, it's going to be radically different as to what was happening in Latin America and in the US. It's very, I mean, it's sad that we see people trying to compare the two systems as if they know anything about the intricacies of this system. And even just before I get into that myth of, Africans sold Africans, right? We should also look at, for example, the Hausa states, right? And here, the male slaves specifically, they were actually challenging people for power. Like, I mean, that's not normal in terms of like what we would consider slavery. And I think that it's been kind of unfortunate because we've seen that, especially after movies like Kunta Kinte came out, right? We have this concept of slavery, and we think if this was slavery, it must have happened like this every single place that has ever existed. But that's it's radically different depending on where you go and where you start in time, right? So in terms of Africans sold Africans, right? I think we need to, first of all, look at the question in and of itself. Because, I mean, on the face of it, it seems like it's correct, right? But we need to be wary of these questions in the first place. So let's interrogate the merit of this question in and of itself, that Africans sold Africans, right? Or sold their own people. And this is the key phrasing that I hear. They sold their own people.
Yeah.
And I question them by asking them, who's their own, right? These were people from different tribes, Fulani, Yoruba. You expected all of them to be friends when they've been fighting for centuries, some of them decades, just war after war after war. Do you expect them to really see themselves as, in quotes, their own people? I don't think so. And the worst thing is that they don't expect us to apply this standard to Europe. They always talk about World War One, and they always talk about World War II, all these wars. They talk about it in terms of countries. So they're like, oh, Britain fought France, right? It's the equivalent of me literally saying, oh, look at Europeans, whites killing whites, or when the Vikings enslaved, the English, people would just be, surprised if I said, oh, look, it's whites enslaving whites. Why must we accept that definition or that paradigm of, having to distill everything to race, especially in that specific argument? That's my first question to them. So there's no duty on another African in that scheme of things to really look at another person from an enemy tribe and look at them as a brother or a friend, right? That's one thing. And also additionally, they're trying to deflect this blame and trying to like sort of make sure that the African leaders are the ones that are shouldering the burden of everything, but what happened abroad, they had nothing to do with that. And even after that, after people, got free from slavery and there was the abolishment of slavery, what followed afterwards? It was segregation. So, I mean, are you going to then blame the African leaders for that as well? And then additionally, we haven't really seen any Pan-African thought come to the fore of the discussion until around the early 1900s. And I believe there was a Pan-African conference in London in 1910. And that was when people started thinking, hey, we need to start having Black people, Black nationalism needs to become an idea that we adopt. We need to start seeing Black people around the world as having similar struggles. And you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois writing loads of works, and obviously with the NAACP as well being brought up as well. All these different organizations were starting to see eye to eye, right? And you'd be surprised. I mean, our ancestors would be surprised to see us collaborating like this, because obviously back then, the indentations in terms of tribe were very different as to what we know today. Nowadays, people say you're from this ethnic group, you're Kikuyu, you're this or that. It's like, oh yeah, you're from that tribe, cool. No one talks about, the Kikuyus fought the Maasais. No one talks about this and that, right? because back then it was inherently different. So I think it's quite anachronistic for people to view it from the lens of, oh, Africans sold Africans. It's no, it's like people were in a situation where they were at war, yes, and they were simply just, they already had an institution of slavery before that, and if you're a prisoner of war, you're most likely going to be incorporated into that. Also, if you're, for example, someone that hadn't paid their debts, or someone that was a criminal, for example, they'd be shipping these people off and selling them to the Europeans gladly because they weren't seen as people from their community. So obviously we have to view it within that context. And that's one of the claims I've debunked several times on my channel.
So in Latin America, there wasn't like a segregation period. However, I argue that just because there wasn't like a segregation period, that doesn't mean there isn't like any racism that exists in Latin America. Because I think that's a big like argument. They'll say, well, there wasn't segregation and there wasn't like the Jim Crow era and redlining and stuff like that. But I'm like, to me, it's weird because like, yeah, maybe they didn't have a law that said that, but that doesn't mean that people didn't have the mentality of white supremacy and caste systems still embedded in their own like thoughts. And I always argue, I say like, yeah, we might not have had segregation, but like if you look at modern day Latin America, like when you look at the disparities in Latin America and you break it down by race, like it's no surprise that like the Black people are always at the bottom when it comes to education, medical care, environmental rights and their environment, just living in general. Like it's no surprise that that Black people or people of the African diaspora are always at the bottom.
Yeah. Because I think there's a difference. I mean, sorry, I keep thinking about the US when I talk about segregation, right? But even within the UK, there was that segregation, right? So there's a difference between de jure and de facto segregation. So de jure is where they're actually going to pass laws and it's going to be very explicit. But just because there's no laws does not prohibit someone, for example, or communities, entire communities, from setting their own, in quotes, red lines, right? And it's literally, that's de facto segregation. Where they're like, it's going to happen by virtue of the fact that obviously after slavery, if slavery is racialized, in a post-slavery society, you don't expect racism to just disappear the day that, the abolishment of slavery happens. No, it's something that's going to last and it's going to endure. And by virtue of that fact, the same way a racist might not want to sit on the same table with a Black person, that goes from being a table to being a neighborhood. And then eventually you have a Black neighborhood and you have a white neighborhood. Yeah. And especially when it comes to working relationships and how this is infused with a capitalistic system, is that you have one group that has been able to accrue a certain amount of wealth and they happen to be white, for example, or lighter skinned. And then you have people who are darker skinned who don't have that wealth, right? But they've been forced into what I'll call a proletariat position, where you have to essentially work for these people just to get your daily wages, And then what you find is that a lot of the rich neighborhoods are actually bordered by what people would call slums, or even just, hoods, right? And then people go there, they work, and then they go back home. That's the dynamic that you see with a lot of these places in post-slavery societies.
Yeah. I want you to, I'm not sure if you're like familiar with this, but like, what is like the racial like code or dynamics in Africa? So, because I think from what I know that in some parts of Africa, if you are of lighter skinned or mixed, you can also even be considered white in some parts of Africa.
Yeah, I guess it really depends because I mean it's a big discussion to have, but I've had several of them on my podcast. But you can see that a lot of people view North Africans who tend to look extremely light-skinned, right? So you find them looking very much like Arabs as well, right? Some people might even call them white, right? Just because of by virtue of the way that they look. And obviously, we know that racism and all these different systems, they would not necessarily class North Africans as white, but as people of color, right? But they, on the face of it, they do look white, right? So some people might think of it that way. But in terms of colorism and how that manifests, there's a huge issue with colorism on the continent in general. We have, I think there was a statistic from the UN that talked about bleaching, skin bleaching in West Africa, and it was like 70% in some countries. It was absolutely crazy. Same thing in East Africa. We have certain issues within certain East African communities of people. It's mainly like, featureism and also a bit of colorism as well. I'm sure you've seen like, some of the, in quotes, Ethiopian and Somali beef versus West African. That, all that back and forth. Sometimes people, that's where you see a lot of those people, right? Minorities within communities coming on, bring up colorist or featurist things. But obviously, I'm not here to say like, one side is the one that's causing all the damage. It's like, back and forth, right? But in terms of South Africa, that's where you see the racial dynamics are very different because apartheid ended in around 1996. So there, I'd say the racial tension in South Africa, when I was living there, you could feel it. You can definitely feel it. And I call South Africa a ticking time bomb because of, the lingering inequality that's remained after apartheid. And it's very much along race lines. And there's even statistics that I think in 2010, it's the white population that was earning 6 times as much as the black population on average, So, I mean, it really just depends in terms of where you go. But in a place like Kenya, for example, you have a very, very small white population. But surprisingly so, even if you look at the grants, the people who receive grants of around $1 million plus on their businesses, right, they tend to be white Americans. And they have far less experience compared to even Kenyans. That's another thing that it's like more like on internalized colonialism. And I can vouch for this. Some of my friends are Nigerian and they've talked about this as well. Where someone's white or they come from Europe, they might just come to Africa and they might just, get a certain job because the employer thinks that, maybe they're bringing skills or like, it's like internalized colonial thought of like, maybe the African is less intelligent than a European, for example. So the racial dynamics really vary depending on where you go.
Okay. And that's coming from Africans who are Black.
Yeah.
So would you say that's kind of like a form of like internalized oppression, like within themselves?
Yeah, most definitely, I'd say so. Even just the thought of colorism, all these different things. It would be something that I would classify as internalized colonialism. But in terms of like, how cognizant do I have to be as an African of my race every single day? It's not really that often as compared to here in the UK or, in the US. It's something that you don't necessarily have to think about your race once in a while. It's like very rarely you do. But when you do find, like, let's say interact with a white person, you have to just also, I'd say, be vigilant. I'm like, my vigilant sense has always just go off because it's like, I don't want to be in a position whereby I've seen certain Africans being, treated very badly, or like, there's that subconscious element of, the white savior mentality. Sometimes it spurs on conversation. So it's not like I'm like, oh, I hate white people or anything. It's like there's that vigilant sense because of what I've experienced as a Black person as a whole. I'm just generally vigilant.
Yeah.
As usual, just in most places that I go.
I wanted to talk about African spirituality. I know I think you practice Islam, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. But what do you know about African spirituality, and like when would you say that Islam and Christianity was introduced to Africa?
Yeah, so I mean, this one is a big one. I'm gonna take a bit of time on each one. In general, in terms of African spirituality, yes, we do know of several different religions that were in place before the advent of what we'd call Islam and Christianity. And we have different beliefs. I haven't really like looked into the area that much, but we have different beliefs, obviously like the Maasai and the relationship with cattle, and obviously, certain initiation practices. But I also know about, I was living in South Africa and, you have people called Sangomas. And these are people who are like, spiritually inclined, and some believe that they can be able to do things like interpret dreams and be able to, even predict some parts of the future, or like, tell you stuff about your future. That's what some people believe. But even if you go to West Africa, there's different, religions over there that people still do practice still today. Although what we've seen is that, Christianity and Islam have become the two main religions. And I'll get into how they came to the continent in a bit. But in terms of African spirituality, what I do notice, especially from people from Abrahamic faiths in general, is that some people tend to sort of look at it like, oh, this must be ridiculous that people believe things like witchcraft, exist and that. And I'm just like looking at other people and I'm saying like, we believe that Moses, peace be upon him, split the Red Sea. And that if someone came from another planet, or like literally we went to the North Sentinel Island, they haven't been in contact with other people for like thousands of years, and we told them that, right? On at first they might be like, what's that about? We've never heard anything like that. They might think of it from that perspective, so they might be shocked. So my question is when you're exposed to those beliefs, right? We believe in miraculous things. Why is it when other people have those beliefs, we ridicule them? When we also believe in the miraculous, right? And I'll even give you an example of another group of people, like the Dogon people of Mali. And they actually believe that they were visited by an extraterrestrial species, and that they came and they taught them certain knowledge. And surprisingly, actually, they were able to, they had knowledge of a star system, a binary star system, and they knew about the orbits of these stars without even using a telescope, right? So people were very shocked by that. But that's what they said, that they got it from those people, and those people called nomos, right? So there's different spiritual beliefs. We have few instances of monotheism, and we obviously have different religions from North Africa as well that were definitely present. But if you want to talk about the spreading of Islam and Christianity, what I'll say is obviously in the beginning, Christianity, I'll start off with Christianity because I do know a bit about this, and I definitely recommend watching Home Team History. They did a small video on Christianity and how it came to Africa. But from the earliest periods, you actually have Abyssinia. That was one of the first places where people accepted Christianity, and that was like a peaceful sort of transition, right? And you can see, obviously, you can look at the churches in Lalibela, and you can look at the churches in different places and see that Christianity was something that's been there for a while. Like it was there pre-colonial, right? And then you have three kingdoms from Nubia that also were Christian. So you have Nubetia, Makuria, and Alodia. So this is after, obviously, the fragmentation of the earlier kingdoms in Nubia, right? But we have Nubetia, Makuria, and Alodia. All of those had accepted Christianity, and it seemed like there was something that was happening en masse. Because when you look at the graves, when they're looking at the the archaeological evidence, they found that people were naming the people, the sons and daughters, after Christian figures, right? So there's also that aspect to it. So in terms of East Africa, that's what I know about Christianity. But also the Portuguese did end up going to the Congo Kingdom, and there were facets of that kingdom as well that also accepted Christianity, right?
But who brought Christianity over?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So there's different theories, especially on how Christianity got to Ethiopia, right? But that's one thing that I'm not too privy to the knowledge about that. But I do know about certain people, for example, doing pilgrimage, right? People who are, for example, Jews, right, going to do pilgrimage in Jerusalem, etc. And then they were hearing about Christianity, etc. And then they went back home, and then that's what they started preaching, right? So that's one thing, that's one possibility, but that's the early period, right? Then you have the second wave of Christianity, which obviously came with colonialism. Mm-hmm. And we do know, and there's an article that's been written by Tarsis Kabwegere. He's a Ugandan, I believe. And he wrote about the dynamics of colonial violence. And he was talking about how it was not just actually, people of native beliefs that were being forced into Christianity, but it was also Muslims within those areas that were being forced into Christianity. So obviously, I'm not saying necessarily that this was something that's inherent of Christianity. I know that Christian scriptures speak against this, but it goes without saying that this happened on a large scale. And there's a reason why, for example, it was more or less like, if you wanted to be educated, you had to be Christian. And that was kind of what was happening in different sects. I mean, sectors of the African continent. And even towards, the southern part of Africa, you had in the Rosvi Kingdom, you actually had a group that was very skeptical of Christianity at first. And they had a specific, I believe it was a missionary that had come, a Portuguese missionary. And the Swahili traders, right, they were Muslim traders, right? They did actually tell the Rosvi people, it was like, these people are trying to do witchcraft on you, right? That's what the Swahili people said. And the Raspberry people went a bit overboard, if I may call it that, right? Because they ended up killing the priest. And not only that, they went to all the Portuguese outposts and they essentially just attacked all the Portuguese outposts. They destroyed all the crucifixes and the churches, and they just they dug up the graves of certain priests. So this was how the Rosby Kingdom reacted to Christianity after what the Swahili traders said. But obviously, you have different kingdoms, like, for example, I believe it was the Wanga Kingdom, that they had some few Muslims as well there, but you also had a few Christians. So that's in terms of Christianity. But obviously, we know that, yeah, a lot of people, it was because of colonialism, like towards the latter parts. But if you want to talk about Christianity that came in the pre-colonial period, you can look at places like Nubia and Ethiopia. As for Islam, though, this is something I've studied extensively. So I do know a bit more about each kingdom and, like, how it exactly, came across Islam. So obviously people ask about, the Arab conquests, essentially. And that's like the main part after the Rashidun Caliphate, right? Where you have the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. They had declared war on the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. So obviously, one thing that I mentioned to people is that you must not view it from an anachronistic, perspective. Like, you can't view it from a present day perspective. Nowadays, we have borders, we have peace treaties, we have the UN, right? So everyone has a common interest in peace, right? But you have to keep in mind, before the Arab conquest even began, right, that the Byzantine army and the Sassanids were at war for 30 years. So when the unification of Arabia happened, keeping in mind that they'd already fought the Romans, and it was a very big battle, right, between the Arabians and certain Roman outposts, there was tension already. So what usually used to happen, even within Africa, for example, within the Songhai Empire and the Moroccans, or the Malian Empire in certain aspects, war was constant. And the institution of war was something that was common because there was two things: a lack of, definitive borders, right? And also there's something in international relations called realism, right? Or medieval realism, where essentially it was, you had to, if you preemptively attacked another kingdom, it's because they were always militarily strong, right? So there was always this sense of, you have to arm yourself, otherwise you yourself are going to be consumed. So this was the norm in Africa, this was the norm in Asia, etc. So this is what sparked the Arab conquests, right? So you obviously already have tension with the Byzantines, and this went into places like North Africa, right? So you have Egypt, and you have, I believe it extended all the way to Libya, right? The Battle of Tripoli, right? Then, of course, you have all the way in the east, the Battle of Al-Qasadiyya, that goes into Iran, what we know as modern day Iran.
Yeah.
But in terms of Africa, there's a book that I'll possibly recommend for you. And there's a book that actually goes into this in depth. It's called The Preaching of Islam by Thomas Walker Arnold, and he's a Jew. So he spoke a bit about Islam as a whole, and especially towards the beginning, the Coptic Christians of Egypt. And this is what he says in his book. Obviously, I respect historical differences of opinion amongst the scholarship, but this is the opinion that I believe to be the one that's true, right? You have the Copts that were essentially under oppressive Byzantine rule. And when the Arabs were fighting the Byzantines, the Copts actually had a counter-revolution as well. So they sparked a revolution against the Byzantines, and that's when the Arabs sort of took over Egypt, right? So after that, what you do have is like a diffusion of Islam, and there's obviously that tolerance, right? So I believe in the second verse of the Quran, the second chapter of the Quran, it does mention La ikraha fil din, which means like you cannot compel someone to accept Islam or religion. So you already have that base. Although we know in some places they did force Islam, I'm not denying that. But if you look at the scholarly opinions on this, in terms of what happened in Africa, that was less of the degree of what happened. So if you look at the Malian Empire, for example, right, what you do see is that it was actually Amazigh traders from North Africa that were trading with the Malian Empire and even the Ghana Empire before that. So you go to a town like Kumbisale and you have a town that belonged to the natives, and then you have another town that had a mosque that was built there, right? And then if you look at, for example, Graham Conner in his book, African Civilizations, he mentions that in specific West African communities, there's actually evidence that there was native burials that were happening, right? So that's also a sign that people were given freedom to practice religion in some senses. And even when you look at Ibn Battuta, who was a Moroccan traveler, he went and visited the Malian Empire, and he talked about the fact that in some places people were walking topless. And obviously within an Islamic society, that's not something that's like considered like, it's anti-normative, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like permissible, right? So that was in response to, he was kind of like surprised because he's also a Muslim scholar, but it shows that in the Malian Empire, it was more like the nobles were the ones that actually accepted Islam, right? But you go to another kingdom like Kanem Bornu, for example, and you have Islam being accepted en masse. And it obviously came as well from North African traders. And the same thing for the Swahili coast, where you have people coming down from Oman, you have people coming down from Yemen, specifically Hadramaut, right, to places like Somalia as well. And even just further down to places like, what we know as modern day Kenya, specifically the towns of Lamu, Malindi, etc. Kilwa, the Kilwa Sultanate as well, they were Muslims. But if you look at the literature over there, it talks about how people accepted Islam from the trading relations that they had. And this is how Swahili culture actually formed and how the Swahili people became Muslim, possibly I'd say, 110 AD, 1010 AD. Right? That's the same time that you start to see Swahili people accepting Islam. Then as for Southern Africa, it's more like people who came from, Malaysia, Indonesia. They came as indentured servants from the Dutch and they worked the fields over there and they practiced Islam over there. So in terms of Islam, if you look at it, even just on a general scale, what historical scholarship does tell us in terms of how it was introduced to Africa, of course, yes, there were some people that were compelled to Islam, especially like there were places in North Africa. But in his book, Thomas Walker Arnold talks about like in Africa in general, the general thing was that it was not generally forced on people. Like just that was one thing that sort of just bonded into different societies. And also the fact that Islam is one of those religions where you don't necessarily have to give up your culture. It's like something that you can practice as long as it's not like, going against a specific religion. So that's one thing that I can definitely let you know about.
So, so there was a time period though where Christianity was also just accepted and people just converted as well.
Yeah.
But it was more forced upon later on through history than Islam.
Yes. So in terms of what you look at, Christianity, I'd say this is how I view it in like a two-waved approach. So you have the first wave where it's mainly East Africa. So we're looking Northeast Africa. So we're looking mainly at obviously the Copts, etc. We're looking at people that are living in Ethiopia and obviously the three Nubian kingdoms that I mentioned. Right. In terms of West Africa, I don't think that they had much connection with Christianity. Right. With of course the exception of the Congo Kingdom. Right. That's like, you can call it North or West, West and like, Central, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, that's the first wave, right? Where it was like sort of accepted. Then the second wave is where it was more or less like you had the forced conversions happening by virtue of colonialism and slavery. That's something that's undisputed in scholarship, right? As for Islam, what you have is from the beginning, it was mainly through trade relationships. And like obviously those historians talk about specific areas where there was major tolerance, but there was tyrants as well. So obviously you have a history of tolerance in general, right? And in general, you have a history of people accepting Islam by virtue of trade. That's what I've learned from my studies in that area.
So my next, I guess, myth or question that I have for you is that sometimes Latin Americans think that it was kind of like a blessing that we were colonized, because they feel like, in a sense, some of them have this, I guess, they have this like mentality of thinking that the native inhabitants of Latin America, which were Native Americans, and depending on where in Latin America, they were all named something different. They think of them as, and not all of them, but some of them think of them as like savages and people that didn't believe in anything. And then they also think about like African spirituality as witchcraft and something bad, like it wasn't like a good thing. And they'll say like, why do you think they converted to Christianity? Like, because like they'll say like, oh yeah, they converted to Christianity because spirituality, African spirituality wasn't like, it was like it was devil work, kind of like that's what they say. Some of them say, and I'm like, just people just are ignorant and they don't really know about this. Even though like if you go to different parts of like Latin America, they still have like different versions of African spirituality in Latin America still today.
Or about religion.
So yeah, it's just it's a little weird, but I guess what I want to know is like, was colonization or like was it helpful for our people? Because like I I would say that the kind of like when I think about success, I think about a country where there's equity among their people, right? But in today, in modern day, you see so much poverty around the world, right? And I think it's because of colonialization from Europeans. Like that's how I see it. So I would say that the poverty that we see in modern day is nothing compared to the poverty that existed uh, pre-colonialization. So what do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because I've literally just made a TikTok today about someone saying, I'm African and I think that colonization, Africa was better during colonization. And if you debate this, then you have an inferiority complex. That's what they said. And I mean, you could not be so far from the truth. Like it's so sad that, I mean, this is like one of the last stages of colonialism where you've really oppressed people to the point where, first of all, you've starved them of any sort of roots of knowledge that they had of their own people. And then you push this narrative down their throat that colonialism was good. According to who? If colonialism, and this is one thing I should tell people, if colonialism was truly about helping Africans, right, there would be no need for violence and there would be no need for the Europeans to lay any of their hands on our resources, right? And this is an area of study that I've looked into, right? And I always mention this article because I think it's one of the most, I tell you, trigger warning. Like, if you really want to read this article, go ahead and read it, right? But there's an article by Issa Shivji called Conditions of the Semi-Proletariat. And I can send it to you if you'd like,
Okay.
right? But it describes the conditions of the workforce, the African workforce in the Tanganyika colony, right? And this is something, obviously, I don't know too much about the colonization of Latin America, but I'm just talking from an African perspective, right? Of, if colonialism worldwide was good for its people, I would say no, right? Because it's inherently extractionary. Another thing that we should keep in mind, right, is that in this colony of Tanganyika, I believe the statistics were between 1901 and 1913 that sentenced over 60,000 Africans to corporal punishment. And you have crazy cases where, like, I mean, there's another case. They've gone into that detail of actually looking into the case law and, like, seeing what's happening over there. So some Africans did take some of the in quotes bosses or managers to court, and the courts did nothing, by the way, right? But there was one infamous case of this other African who was told, he was a cook, but then the goat went missing, right? So then one of the workers, one of the ladies that was, the wife of the boss, right? She said, "Where's the goat? We have to have dinner today. Where's the goat?" He said, I'm just a cook. I don't know what you're talking about." So she asked another worker to tie him up, and they basically, suffocated him, right, with a rope. And then, this man just woke up and he was in a store and he was locked up. He had to crawl through a hole, right? The conditions were so bad, right, that people were sleeping in a bed meant for one person and there were 3 people there, right? And people used to get hookworm disease from stepping on excrement, right? Because they were not taking care of even the lavatories, right? And if you look at the cases of even shingles in the Lupa gold mines, right? That's another thing. If you look at that, you have hundreds of people getting shingles, and also those people that were eating, food that was just not cooked, right? So you'd have people that would just literally mix, like, maize and beans, and they'd just eat them raw and they'd cover them in like flour, right? So this is what colonialism was like. And for people to like justify that, my question to you is like, what is wrong with you? right? When you look at King Leopold's Congo, for example, you have people who are being told to pick rubber, right? And keep in mind, you have to be very early to pick rubber. Even today, it's very difficult to get rubber out of the rubber trees. You get up early, and sometimes it takes you up to 5 hours to even get a small bit of that rubber, right? And obviously, what was rubber used for? It was used mainly to make these conveyor belts, etc. So it was basically building Europe,
Yeah.
So these people were being told to get rubber, and if they didn't, their hands would be cut off. For some of the women, their breasts would be cut off. And literally, you have 10 million plus that were being killed during this period. And people talk about the Holocaust, right? And obviously that was terrible. And I'm not taking anything away from that, right? But how is it that we've never learned about this, right? Why is this not something that is, taught to the children of Belgium? Simply because they don't care, right? They even have candy that literally talks about the cut hands, right? It's shaped literally they're shaped like chocolate hands.
Oh, yes.
Right? And I'm pretty sure you've seen that. It's like a mockery of what's going on, right? And of course, you have World War I people being forcibly recruited into the armies, etc. And then the main thing is, I'll tell you this, right? Before colonialism, let's look at what the conditions were like, right? I'm going to be relying on European accounts on what African civilizations looked like. Let's start off with the Kingdom of Benin. Lorenzo Pinto in 1691, Portuguese captain, talked about this city being, as far as the eye can see, buildings. And Alfred Dapper, another Dutch explorer, mentions that in the Kingdom of Benin, they never even used to lock their doors, right? Because it was that safe, right? And obviously, the Benin Wall is the largest earthworks completed before the mechanical age, like around 16,000 kilometers long. At one point, some people even thought it was longer than the Wall of China, the Great Wall of China, right? Then, of course, you have the Malian Empire, right? You have the golden age of, it was around the 13th, 14th century, right? Where you have scholarship, you have 25,000 students within the University of Sankore. And that was one of the first universities in the world, in Africa, by the way, right? And obviously you have half of the old world's gold, it came from Mali. That's why Mansa Musa was the richest man in history, because half of the old world's gold was from there. And some actually theorize, those actually rumors that went all the way till Venice, the markets of Venice. People were talking about Mansa Musa. And these were the rumors that spread around Europe. And the Spanish actually thought this was El Dorado that they were talking about, which is actually what made them curious about what's going on in West Africa. We're hearing these stories about people coming with gold, right? You can look at that specifically. If you want to talk about other cities, you can go to the Ajuran Sultanate in East Africa, right? Mogadishu was the richest city in Africa in around the 14th century. And even the Malian Empire itself, just to track back a bit, according to Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, a scholar here in the UK, he estimates that within the 14th century, it was the richest state in the world. Right? So what were they doing for us? What did colonialism truly do for us? Right? If you want to go further down, and I'm not mentioning Egypt because people already know it was a great civilization. Same thing for Nubia as well, though. People forget that there's more pyramids in Nubia compared to Egypt, right? But even that was a great civilization. You have writing. Even the people of the people of Liberia, the Vai people specifically. Here's another interesting fact that some scholars actually mention that the Vai people of Liberia, within the 19th century, they may have been more literate than in many areas in Europe and the US, right? Because they had their own form of writing. They had their own schools where they teach Vai, right? And the Vai script may have also been influenced by Cherokee script because a Native American actually came to Liberia. But that's another story for another day, right? About that connection. But even in Southern Africa, you can look at great civilizations like the Zulu civilization. Look at the King Moshoeshoe and how he actually implemented a form of democracy. So if we're talking about Greece, we're talking about Rome, about democracy. Why don't we talk about, Lesotho, right? And Moshoeshoe, right? The fact that he had his own form of democracy. Why don't we talk about Ubuntu? We talk about Marx and all these different people, right? We'll never learn about the communalist ideals of people in Southern Africa and things like Ubuntu, I am because we are.
Yes.
Right? We will never mention these things, right? So even the Swahili, let's look at the Swahili states, although unfortunately they were involved quite extensively in the Arab slave trade. There was quite there was quite a few cities like, the Kilwa Sultanate, where they had they printed, they had their own currency. They minted their own coins, and they were gold coins. I mean, that's something back in that time when you were minting gold coins, that was insane. Same thing for Aksum, right? So when people talk to me about, oh, colonialism did this, all it did was interrupt trade routes, and it was there to extract minerals and resources from the African continent and use us as cheap labor. This is the truth about colonialism. And if anyone tells me anything different, then I'm going to be very skeptical of the answers that they give me.
Yeah, there is that there is that mentality in the Latinx community where they believe that colonialism saved our indigenous and Black people, and I'm like, really though, because like from my knowledge, I know that like Africans come from a very communal like way of being, right? And I don't think we got that from our Spanish side. and my argument is, I think that the only reason why Spanish people might have that is because the Moors, were in Spain and ruled over Spain for 700 years. So maybe during that period, the Spanish people picked up that a bit of that aspect of the communal living. But I cannot sit here and say that is innately Spanish. If anything, I always say that Latinx people get their communal way of being and way of life from our African ancestry and from our indigenous ancestry from Latin America. So going off of that, I would love for you to explain what does the term Moors mean, and who were the Moors? Like racially, like I know that there was different racial Moors, but who are the Moors? What does that word mean? And who were the Moors that ruled over Spain?
Yeah, so this is also a topic that I'll say I'm not an expert in, but I know a bit of knowledge, and I know like the main scholarly opinion in regards to that. So obviously, I think we should first of all start off by, also just saying in terms of authenticity of the narrative, let's try and also be authentic. And it's okay if all the Moors were in Black. We already have our own achievements, guys. It's okay, right? It's not something we should be like, clutching towards. But we should also notice a couple of things, right? If you look, and I'm obviously taking a lot from Home Team History and what they've said on the topic.
Yeah.
But I've also talked to different professors about it, and they've had different opinions, right? But generally, the word Moor is something that, it was used by Europeans, and it referred to different groups. Here's what gets tricky, because, people didn't really know who it referred to, right? For example, like when people mention Berbers, right? Yes. Obviously, it's a derogatory term because it has a root in the word barbarian, right? Mm-hmm. So, you have people in North Africa being mentioned as Berbers, right? But you also have people called Barbaroi, right? In obviously the Romans called some aspects of like the Somali communities there, they classify them as Barbaroi. So that's one of the words. Like it just shows you about how some people call, oh, you're a Moor, right? But like it's different and it's interchangeable. But if we actually look at the kingdoms or like the specific dynasties that actually took over Spain, you can look at the Almoravid dynasty, right? So obviously these are North Africans. Arabized or non-Arabized, I can't give you the details on that because I'm not too sure. But I do know one thing for sure. We have evidence of Black soldiers, specifically from West Africa, being used in armies or as mercenaries, mainly for even Arabs. Like if you want to look at Nubian archers, for example, they were even used by the Sassanids, right? And because Nubian archers were particularly ferocious, like people were quite scared of Nubian archers, called them the pupil smiters. But they were definitely, mentioned in, certain scripts, as these were people that were in the army, right? Even the Fatimids, for example, the Fatimid, that was a Shia, I believe was a dynasty that was there present in Egypt. They did have a guard of Black soldiers specifically, right? But even when you look at the the Almoravid dynasty specifically, they did also use black soldiers. And like, this is obviously where you see, obviously, those paintings of black people. But in terms of what I know, right? And I've talked to different people from North Africa about this as well. It's like, the Moors would roughly be referring to people from that area, but also some West Africans that were mercenaries. So can I say en masse, like there were black people? I'd say probably a large amount were, but I'd say that it's not necessarily like a majority, right? And it's not like something that we can sort of grasp to and say, this is our culture, this is our, this is us, right? Obviously, there's certain aspects of that we can share into that, but to say that this is our narrative and no one can touch it, I would say that that's something we should avoid, right? But largely so. We know that the Moors were mainly they were Muslims actually, and that's actually one of the dynasties. And I'm glad that you brought it up because we can have a intersectional discussion about Islam, and also we can talk about tolerance, right? So obviously there's something called the Convivencia that was alleged to have happened in Spain, and this was in Andalus, which was it was there because of the Almoravid dynasty, Almohads, etc. Right? So when you look at that rule specifically at different periods, there's a Yale scholar by the name of Mariah Monocle. She wrote a book called, I believe it's called The Oracle of the World, right? And she actually argues that there was considerable religious tolerance between the Jews, Christians, and the Muslims who are obviously the ones in charge. And you have people like Ibn Hazm, may Allah be pleased with him. He's one of the scholars that actually, he was a Muslim scholar that was, quite good at comparative religion. But the question is, why was he good at comparative religion? It's because he was living at a time where Jewish scholarship was actually flourishing, right? So these were North African Muslims that had definitely come to Spain. And yeah, at times, obviously, there was like revolutions, etc. This was 700 years. A lot happened during that period. But there were considerable periods of time where there was that tolerance of religion. But in terms of like the Moors and who they were, it was definitely most likely people from North Africa. And there was a mixture of Amazigh people, Arabized Amazigh, etc. And also West Africans as soldiers and mercenaries, and some even coming as slaves. That's what I'd say for now that I know. But obviously I'd say, research guys, I know there's differing opinions on this. So don't necessarily take what I say as gospel, but this is the opinion that I believe, as far as I know, to be true.
I think I've gotten through all my questions.
Awesome.
But no, this was so helpful. I think that this will shed a lot of light on the community and just give them more insight about our African history, because it's our African history too, even though some people might not see it like that, and help them for me, in my opinion, just be more or less colonial, like having that less colonial mindset.
Yeah.
Also, like it's a lot of it is also rooted in anti-Blackness as True. Well. I definitely think this will help, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate having you, and feel free to use any of this once I put it up on YouTube, on TikTok if you like. I don't know if you have a YouTube channel, but can you share what are your like handles as well, like if you have TikTok or YouTube or podcasts and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. So currently I have a TikTok, and Instagram as well, podcast as well. The name is the same, Pariah Nation. So at PARIAH, then just nation, right? And also I've just recently started a YouTube channel, and I have a new video actually coming out called 3 Myths About African History. So it's a bit of a coincidence, but I'm currently editing that video now. I'm a bit overdue on when I should have posted it, but it should be coming up soon. I do lots of videos on African politics. A lot of my stuff is on African history as well. And that's what my YouTube channel will mainly be about. But yeah, you can also find me on TikTok as well, where I talk about the same things. It's just at Pariah Nation.
All right. Thank you so much. Right, y'all. So y'all saw it. This was some African history that y'all might not know about. And I hope that y'all found this video helpful and informative. Don't forget to hit a like, leave a message, and subscribe to Afro LatinX. Bye.